I wanted to make sure that we all had a conversation about Judges. It's fall and our schedules are all busy and changing, and that's normal. So I'm going to start trying to do some more video conversations so I can keep the conversation going, and we can still stay on goal. Those of us who are trying to finish getting through the Bible in a year, we can stay together and on goal. And Judges. I just feel like we haven't got a chance to have in-depth discussion about Judges with most of you. And when you get to that book, those who have read it, they have lots of questions. Judges is probably the most horrific, violent book in the Bible, and it begs to ask the question, why is this book in the Bible? What on earth is, the stuff in the Bible are things God wants us to know. What on earth would he be trying to do here? So I want to give us some background on Judges so that it's not overwhelming and you can see the purpose behind Judges, because first you need to understand when Judges was written. Up until this point, we've finished the books of law, and we started Joshua. Joshua is the first book of history. So we're entering a section of the Bible called the history section, and it's the history of the Israelite people from when they enter into the Promised Land. And so that's where we're at in the story. And so the book of Judges, after Joshua dies and that generation that Joshua brought over and taught and told to obey God and listen, everything that God and Moses were afraid of happened. As soon as that generation died off, the next generations forgot about the miracles, forgot about God, and just kind of did whatever they wanted. And in fact, even in Judges, it says this was the period of time there's no established government for the Israelite people yet. So these judges that are just kind of leaders kind of emerge. So tradition holds that the prophet Samuel wrote Judges. We're going to see Samuel coming up in the books after Judges, but Judges covers this huge chunk of time. Some say it's over 400 years. There's some disagreement on how long that time actually is and some overlap. And some people say it's only like 200 years. But the point is, it's a big chunk of time. And Judges was written after the fact. So, all of the books so far have been written at the same time and written by Moses, written by Joshua, written in context of the same time. Now, Judges is written after all of these events have happened. And like I said, we think the prophet Samuel recorded all of Judges. And so I kind of asked my question, why? Why would leadership like Samuel and the kings, why would they commission to have a book like Judges written? Because it tells some terrible things about the Israelite people during that period of time. And so all these questions start to arise, why would they do that? Kind of think you want to maybe cover it up. But when you really start to read Judges, don't get bogged down in all of the details and knowing what you're going to hear. A lot of weird things, a lot of places, a lot of names and peoples and places that are hard to say, to pronounce. Don't get distracted by that. You see, Judges is really a book that's all about hope. And you look at that and you say, how could all of this violence bring hope? And I'm finding a lot of what you would say maybe peace and understanding in my reading Judges this time, and a lot of hope for me, because the world as it is today is very similar to that period of time that the Judges went through, where it's just godlessness and people did whatever they want. And so that's kind of the society that we live in now. A lot of times everybody can make up their own rules. Everybody does what's best for themselves. And what you see is this beautiful picture of, even though, humanity falls to its lowest low, God is still faithful. God still redeems. God still saves, no matter how bad it gets. And so in the book of Judges, it's like a spiral keeps happening, and it's a downward spiral, and the Israelite people kind of fall farther and farther and farther down into the pit, so to speak. And most of their trouble is because God told them when they went into the promised land that they were, in some cases, to kill all of those original residents, the people that lived there, or drive them out of the land. And the Israelite people failed to do that, which in itself you would think, well, we didn't want, that's not so bad. Why would they kill them or do all that kind of thing? But here's the point. God knew if they lived alongside all of those people that worshiped other gods, that had other rituals, that had idols, that had all of these things, that those things would become part of the Israelite culture, because people would say, oh, we do this, and so, we can do that, we can have that celebration, and so that's really the reason behind, if they could have lived with people, we say the phrase here, we live in the world, but not of the world. The Israelite people couldn't manage that distinction. They couldn't live in the world and not let the world affect them and their behavior and their obedience. And so you see this spiral, and there's a pattern to it. There's a very clear pattern to it, and I'll show you this on the screen. But it's a circular pattern, and what happens is the Israelite people fall into sin. Most of the sin talked about in, maybe all of it, I have to go back and look, has to do with idol worship, worshiping other gods, rituals of other peoples that are ungodly. All these things are happening. There's sacrifice, there's rape, there's sexual immorality. All of these things are happening because the people that live there, that's their way of life, and that's part of their rituals of what it is to live in their world. And God gets angry with that. And I struggled with this a little bit, because I often say God doesn't punish, and Jesus really only got angry one time, and really there's only really one reason for God to be angry, and even the Bible says He's jealous for us. When we turn to another god, that's what angers Him. None of our other shortcomings. So it says God got angry, and then He allowed oppression by the Israelite people, and great, suffering and stuff came out of that. So it's this pattern that there's this sin. God gets angry. God says, okay, kind of do it on your own. He's not punishing, but he's stepping out of the way and letting the enemies and the people in the surrounding communities take the Israelite people as slaves, put them into these kind of circumstances. And then the people cry out. Then they finally say, God, help us. God, help us. You said you never leave us. And God, in his faithfulness, sends salvation and rescues his people again. And he does it usually through a judge. In the book of Judges, he one of the judges he uses to rescue his people. And then there's generally a period of peace and everything is good. And then that judge dies, the people forget again, they fall into sin again, and then God gets angry again, and God steps out of the picture, lets them be overtaken by their enemies. The people suffer. They finally cry out to God. And then God, again, in his faithfulness, sends someone to be their salvation and to rescue them. And then after that, there's peace. And then the judge dies and the whole cycle begins. And in each cycle, you can see the depravity just getting worse and worse. We're going to take a look at, there's over 14 judges, but we're going to take a look at 7 of the major ones that are judges and 7 of these major cycles that happen just briefly and shortly. So you can see how this cycle just keeps going down and down and down. And as I'm saying this and saying, sin and God steps out of the way, oppression by the enemies, people cry out, and God sends salvation. Hopefully, to some of you, this is sounding a lot like what Jesus did. And that's exactly what this is. This is the pattern showing us, putting down and showing us the sin cycle, and that we get the ultimate judge. We get Jesus, and the cycle stops with him. The cycle stops. We use a lot of that language in modern day, psychology and stuff. Let's let this pattern stop with our generation. Well, this pattern stopped with the arrival of Jesus, when he brought salvation to all peoples, not just the Israelites. And so we're going to take a look at some of those things briefly and hopefully give you a better kind of understanding, so you're not overwhelmed by what you're reading, and you just can, find the hope and find the reassurance that Judges can bring when you understand it in that light. So are you ready? I'm about to simplify and fast forward all of the cycles in Judges. I try to keep the videos to about 15 minutes because I think that's an attention span. And this one, we'll go over that a little bit, but there's just so much, and I want you to be able to get a grasp of understanding. So here goes. We're going to start in Judges, and I'm going to read to you the cycle of the first judge. And his name is Othniel. And I'm going to read Judges chapter 3, and I'm going to start at verse 5. And this is what it says. The Israelites lived among the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. They took their daughters in marriage and gave their own daughters to their sons, and they served their gods. So we see the Israelites are doing everything Moses and God were afraid of, warned of. It goes on to say in verse 7, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and the Asherahs. The anger of the Lord burned against Israel so that he sold them into the hands of Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Aram Naharaim, to whom the Israelites were subject for 8 years. But when they cried out to the Lord, he raised up for them a deliverer, Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, who saved them. The Spirit of the Lord came on him so that he became Israel's judge and went to war. The Lord gave the Cushan king of Aram into the hands of Othniel, who overpowered him. So the land had peace for 40 years until Othniel, son of Kenaz, died. And then in verse 12 it goes, again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And so you can see the cycle just goes into the next cycle there. So after Othniel, you have a judge, and his name is Ehud. Again, they fall into sin and worshiping other gods, and God puts them under the rule of the Moab king. He lets that happen for 18 years. And they cried out again, and God raises up Ehud. And Ehud actually goes and he kills this Moab king who, it details, he was a very large king. He was very fat. And when Ehud kills him, he stabs him with a dagger, and it goes all the way in his body, and the fat closes around it. So he leaves, and the people that are wondering what happened to the king, they come in and they can't tell what's happened because they can't see even the knife wound because of that. So a little bit graphic. That's where it starts to get a little bit more kind of graphic. Then we get to Deborah, and Deborah, a personal favorite of mine and a personal favorite of many of the women, because it shows in even the earliest times women were allowed leadership roles, and God used women just the same as he used men. And so in this story, they are subject to the king of Moab again, and Deborah is raised up, so she is going to send the Israelite army. She gets them together, and she's going to send them to destroy the Moabites. And the general, who's a guy in front of the general, he's like, we're not doing that. We're way outnumbered. I am not doing that. You can come do that. And so Deborah says, okay, I'm going to come do that, and it will go down in history that Moab was destroyed by a woman. And so she goes, they destroy the army, and some of the army generals flee, and one in particular, his name is Sisera, and he flees when the army's defeated, and he goes for shelter in the home of some people there. And the woman, her name's Jael, and she pretends to be nice to this Sisera and gives him something to drink, hides him, tells him to, here you can have rest. And when he falls asleep, she takes a big metal tent spike and pounds it through the temple of his head. The stories are progressively getting a little bit more graphic and a little bit more and so after Deborah, after all of this, she liberated them from the king of Moab, and Jael, she helped drive in that victory, so to speak. There's another 40 years of peace and not oppression for the people. But the Midianites come in, and they are, hostile to the Israelites. They destroy all their crops. And so Gideon is this next judge that God approaches. I guess that's how you would say it. God approaches to rescue the situation and save the Israelites from the Midianites. But Gideon, he wants proof all the time. He's like asking God, well, I don't know. Is this really? And I need a sign. And so he's a very doubtful. We say doubting Thomas. I think doubting Gideon is kind of a good phrase as any. And so Gideon comes in. He ends up destroying the altar, the Midianite altar to the god Baal. And he asked God again. He's like, well, I don't know. God says, there's 15,000 men, and God says, you have too many men, Gideon. What? Too many men to go in and conquer the battle? He says, God tells him he only wants him to take 300. And Gideon's like, well, that can't be right. So God, if I'm understanding you correctly, this is what you're going to do. You're going to put a fleece, which is like, like the animal fleece of a sheep. I'm going to put it out in this field. And when I wake up in the morning, if everything is dry around it and that's wet, I'll know that's a good sign. So God does that. But then the next day, Gideon's still not sure. He's still doubting. So he says, well, this time, God, do it the opposite way. So Gideon's always asking for signs. And he does rescue and save the people. And he does such a good job that the Israelite people at that time, they want Gideon to be their leader. They want to almost have him for a king, but Gideon says, no, that's not what God wants. We worship God, and that's it. Well, the people erected, it says an ephod, which I guess you could think of it, like a monument to Gideon and what had happened. And it becomes a thing people walk by, and really it becomes an idol. And so after Gideon, his son Abimelech decides that, well, I don't know what my dad was talking about. I think it would really be great to be a leader. And so Abimelech is referred to as the anti-judge. And that's because he wasn't a judge. He never intended to be a judge. He wanted to be a ruler of the Israelite people, and he went in and tried to conquer other people around. He went on the instead of just being a defensive judge, he went on the offense and wanted to conquer people. And he would go and take the armies into towns, and he would starve the people out. He would burn down the center of the city with the live people inside it. He just took the Israelite people into this place where that they were not at all following and being God's people. They were in it for themselves, I guess. And so the interesting thing that happens with Abimelech is he goes and he's conquering this one town, and they're laying siege, and they're outside the walls, and they're going to set it on fire. And some lady drops a big rock on his head and he kills him. So kind of an interesting story. Again, we have the violence and burning people alive and all that kind of things. After Abimelech, there are some other judges, and the spiral keeps going. And you get to another judge, Japheth. And at that time, the people again were serving the god of Baal, and they were living with the Philistines and the Ammonites, and they were just doing whatever those people did and practicing their religious and their gods' rituals. And so God gave them over to the Philistines again. And what you see with Japheth is he tries to bargain with God. I don't know if, so maybe we're all guilty a little bit of that. If you're praying, if you pray for things, you say, oh God, I'll never do this again. If only you do this. Oh God, I will do this for you. I promise to be good. I promise to give up doing this sin. I promise to sacrifice to you if only you do this. Well, Japheth bargains with God, and he says to God, if you let me overcome this Philistine army, when I get home, I will sacrifice to you the first thing that comes out of my door. So he wins the battle, he goes home, and the first thing that comes out of the door is his daughter. And so Japheth is like, well, I guess I have to follow through. It's God. And so they end up letting the daughter go off for a while and spend some time with their friends, and then the daughter willingly comes back and she's sacrificed. And God did not want that sacrifice. He did not ask for that. So I know when you're reading it, some people, why would God have him kill? No, God did not ask for that. It was not, even says God was not happy. He was not pleased. And what ends up happening, they overthrow the Philistines. And what's really interesting as after that happens, the tribe of Ephraim, the Ephraimites, which are another tribe of Israel, they get mad at Japheth because they didn't include them. So Japheth went and fought the Philistines and conquered all of this, and they did it just with his people. And the Ephraimites are like, what? I thought we were one, and you're going off and doing this. So they get really mad. And there's this thing, and what I see here, it's the first time there's like internal disagreement and disagreement between the tribes. Most of the other times in all of these downward spirals, you see it's outside people that are causing the problem and oppression and the disagreements. But when you get to here, these are their own people. And so it gets a little bit interesting. You can kind of follow those patterns. We finally get to Samson, which Samson might be the one judge you've heard the story of, Samson and Delilah. But a lot happens in that story. Under the Israelites are again under oppression of the Philistine people. And there's a childless couple, and God tells them He's going to give them a baby that's going to be the deliverer of the people from the Philistines. Sound kind of familiar? Some foreshadowing of what God's plan entails and what's going to happen. So this woman has this baby, and God says, raise this baby as a Nazirite, which is just dedicated to God. And so Nazirites, John the Baptist was a Nazirite. You don't cut your hair. You don't. You make a vow to the Lord. You don't drink. You don't do any of these things. Men and women could make this Nazirite vow and consecrate themselves to God. And so that's what was meant for Samson. And so because of this, God gave him just enormous strength. He was just the strongest man, like Hercules, that there was. And so Samson kind of had, I guess, an Achilles heel. And he liked the ladies. And he always picked the wrong ones. So he finds this one girl, and he wants her for his wife. And his dad says, no, that's not. We need to keep within, God said, marry within the Israelites. And he said, no, I want this other wife. So he goes, and they're going to get married, and Samson gives this riddle to the father-in-law and says, if you can solve this riddle, I will give you such and such. And if you can't solve the riddle, then you're going to give me like 30 of this thing and silver and like a big dowry kind of. Well, they keep badgering the wife to tell the answer. And so eventually this wife, the wrong girl, she tells them the secret, and then Samson doesn't win the bet about the riddle. So he gets really, really mad and angry, and he leaves the wife there. And the dad ends up giving that wife to another relative. So Samson goes back home mad. He realized maybe that was the wrong woman, but then he gets back home and he decides, oh, well, I really did want her. And so he goes to get her back, and then he finds out she was already given to someone else. And so then that makes him mad. And he goes off, and on his journey, he meets a prostitute named Delilah, and he becomes smitten with Delilah. And the Philistines are pressuring Delilah to find out where um, Samson gets his strength from, where is his weakness. So she keeps like asking them, and they keep trying to come arrest him, and they'll bind him with different ropes and stuff, and he just breaks everything. So she tries to get him to tell the secret, and finally she gets the secret out of him, that it's because he never cut his hair. And of course she cuts her hair, and then the Philistines, they capture Samson and they blind him, gouge his eyes out, and they put him in the prison. And then the Philistines decide, well, they're having some kind of festival. Let's bring Samson out for our entertainment. Who knows what they were going to do or what they had intended. But what they didn't realize is that Samson's hair was starting to grow back. And so all of the leaders of the Philistine people, and all of a huge amount of people, were all gathered in this structure. And when Samson was brought out there, he positioned himself. He's blind, remember? So he positioned himself between two of the columns, and he brings down, he ends up, because he regained his strength, unbeknownst to the Philistines, he takes out the whole building. He kills himself, crushes himself, and all of the Philistine leadership there. So that's how Samson ends up delivering the people from the Philistine rule at that time. So now we're approaching the end of Judges, and we get to chapter 19, in a story I like to refer to as the Levite and the wicked Benjamites. I said before, there's this spiral. And Judges almost creates this feeling, this tension within you when you're reading it. You can almost feel that spiral. And it goes all the way down till you get to this point where the lowest of low happens within Israel. Earlier, I said you could notice that the disagreement, the fighting, usually was with people outside, and then it started happening between the different tribes. And so that's significant. They're falling more away from their, from their families, from their culture, from everything that God had set up for them. And so we get to this final story, and it's not a story about a judge. It's a story about Israel in general. And what happens in this story that is quite graphic, Levite, he takes a concubine for a wife, and she goes off and goes home. She leaves him. So the Levite wants to go back and get her for his wife. He wants to do right by her and take care of her and go get her. So they journey to the father's house of this woman who's referred to as the concubine, but I don't like to refer to her that way. But they go back to the house to get her, and the dad is stalling because he doesn't want the daughter really to leave, and he doesn't really want the Levite man to take his daughter, and he's going to miss her. So there's like this period where he's stalling, and they end up staying longer than they want to. And they go to leave to travel home and they have to travel. It's a long distance to travel home, and it starts to become late and dark. And the servant that's traveling with them, it's the servant, the Levite, and this concubine, now wife. He wants to stop. They're like, we need to stop. We just need to stop for the night. And the Levite says, we cannot stop. We're not in Israel territory. It is not safe to stop. I'm not going to stop until we are in Israelite land, and we're in the land of our family where we'll be safe. So they travel on, and they get there and finally get to an Israelite town, and there's an older gentleman they run into, and the older gentleman says, "Come stay the night at my house, please. I welcome you to come stay the night, and I'll feed you and stuff." So the Levite and the servant and the concubine wife, they go to enjoy this hospitality, and they're in the tribe of Benjamin. They're with the Benjamites, and so they think they're safe, right? He didn't want to stop anywhere but with where he knew he would be safe. Well, a group of Benjamite men come to the house where they are staying, and they demand, and they're beating on the door, and they ask. They don't ask, they demand. They want the Levite and the Levite servant to come out, and it says literally they want to have sex with the Levite and his man. And so it's this group of wicked men, it says, and they come and they demand, "Give us these men that are staying overnight in your house. We want to have sex with them." So the key thing you have to remember here too is these aren't Philistines. These aren't, Amorites or Canaanites. These are Benjamites. And so they demand this, and just similar when we read in the Old Testament in Genesis, there's a story about Lot. And the angels of God come and stay with Lot. And the same thing, the people in the town come and they're like, they want to have sex with these angels. And so what happens is, just as Lot did, this person, the host, says, "Take my daughter. Take my daughter and just have, please don't do this terrible thing to my guests, and I have a daughter you can have." And they weren't happy with that. And so it ends up, they take the concubine wife, and they take her and they gang rape her. And in the morning, she's lying on the doorstep of the house to get on, and a Levite man comes out, sees her laying there, and she's dead. So the Levite takes her home, and when he takes her home, he doesn't bury her. He cuts her body up into 12 pieces, and he sends one of each of the pieces to each of the 12 tribes of Israel. And it's a wake-up call. It says what he's doing by doing this is saying, this is Israel who did this horrific thing. What has become? We are all guilty. The Benjamites, they early on in Judges, it reminds us that the Benjamites did not get rid of the idol worship. They just started worshiping the idols and gods that were there with the people that were already there. So they fell into these things like human sacrifice and sexual immorality and all of these things that they copied from the society around them. Well, it's dramatic, it's sad, and you get to this point where, like, what else worse could happen? And what ends up happening is the Israelites, I put on there, the Israelites finally get woke when this happens. They finally all get together after, they all receive part of this dead woman that was killed by one of their own tribes. They come together and they decide as a community, what are we going to do about this? And they end up punishing the Benjamites. They're like, how are we going to, restore our nation? And so they punish the Benjamites. They kill a lot of them. They go send the army, about 25,000 Benjamites they kill right away. And it even says that 600 of the fighting men fled to cities, and they hunted down all 600 of those ones that fled. And so they punished the Benjamites, got rid of a lot of the wickedness. But then they were left with this dilemma: how will the Benjamites be restored? And so you hear stories, because they made a rule, no one should take a Benjamite for a wife, or no one should, marry, because they've done these things. So they go about finding wives to restore the lineage of the Benjamites after they punished and took out a big chunk, so they could rebuild and restore anew the nation, the 12 tribes of Israel. And that's where, it's almost exhausting when you get to the end of it and you just are like, they finally kind of see. And then you're going to see what happens next, because this period of turmoil where everybody did what they wanted to do and there was no leader, no government, is going to turn over, and you're going to see the monarchy and government put in charge. Of course, we know it's not going to be perfect, and those kings and leaders they put in charge, some of them are going to be good and some of them are going to be bad. But it marks the change of what the next chapter is going to be. And so I hope that you get something out of the book of Judges, and maybe have a little bit clearer idea, and can kind of look at that, almost that feeling that some of you get when you're reading it, that feeling, that tension, that feeling that you feel. It's almost a good thing, because you're feeling you're feeling frustration, you're feeling all of that, people are just not being obedient after all God had done and continued to do for them. And, take hope and rest in the idea that God is always faithful. Even when you fall to the lowest of lows, God is faithful to his children.